So, hi, welcome. My name is Fabien Mathey, and I'm happy to be able to present this to you today. The question I have before we start, risk assessment, does that speak to anyone? Everybody knows what it is, risk assessment? Yes, more or less. Anyone had the chance already to perform a risk assessment? No? Yeah? Okay, good. So I'm going to start with some kind of optimization. And for that, I'm going to start with a small story onto why we want to optimize this process. So before we started, so it was 2012, like before 2012. Sounds like ages ago. But before 2012, we discovered that risk assessment was not very optimized or accessible to small to medium-sized enterprises. Because if you performed the risk assessment, it was usually big solutions or some sheets of paper that you tried to figure out where your risks were. So this was an idea that something that we needed to do because based in Luxembourg, huge-sized companies, pretty rare. So it was better an idea to start with smaller ones. So when we performed risk assessments, also what happened before was because it took so much time to fill out the forms or to perform it on bigger solutions with very detailed risks, often enough, when we presented the reports, they were outdated. So it took 6 months to perform a risk assessment. So 6 months down the road, everybody knows it goes quick, so outdated. Then, of course, every time you asked a person, like, should we do a risk assessment? The first answer was, there is no time. Right? So you looked at the calendar, everybody's like busy, 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 so nobody could actually perform risk assessment. And then the last big challenge that we usually faced was no money, right? No money to buy solutions, no money to invest in security, and so on and so forth. And of course, the last point, which is linked to money, is there is no internal experts, right? So that was basically the problems we faced before 2012. And then, of course, comes the best practices. Best practices, everybody knows that they are, very well. So people actually answered us sometimes, well, we have a badge, so we must be secure. Badges, you know, those security badges that they say, right? So that is not necessarily a good thing. And then the other stuff that we heard is like, yeah, I know what I'm doing, so I don't need a password, right? So passwords are for beginners. Nobody needs passwords. Nobody needs any protection. Usually what we saw the most, sadly, is that locking computers was not normal for most people. That is a sad thing, because we had, even when we came to receptionists, sometimes they left the reception with 5 people sitting there, computer unlocked for half an hour, which was great for us. You can see where we're going. But then the lessons learned were easy. So most companies face the same basic risks, right? So not locking computers, no Wi-Fi passwords are not good, and so on and so forth. So even when they are compliant, sometimes security was left a little bit on the side. And then they all face the same challenges. We have time, we have no money, and we have no internal experts. So then we set out to work, or start to work, with the help of many companies and partners. And we started because every respectable risk assessment tool has to start somewhere with a spreadsheet application. So as a recipe, you start with a spreadsheet application. Next thing you do is you pick a standard, some standard. In our case, we chose ISO 27005 for ease. It was easier for us. Then we went ahead and do our risk identification, or our 3, let's put it like the 3 phases, basically, where there is the context establishment, the risk identification, and the evaluation and risk treatment plan. These are like the main basic ones. But we also added, like also in the ISO 27005, the implementation and monitoring phase, basically, which we thought was interesting or important, because if you have a great report with all the security risks and recommendations, if nobody does anything, that report and time was wasted, right? And we had we had times where we actually arrived, we wanted to submit the report, and it was almost directly thrown away because it was too big. And then, of course, there's the iteration part, whereas do it again, and again, and again, and again, right? So it's basically like the PDCA model where we go. The next one, the big one, was the licenses, with the money though, right? Licenses is always a tricky part, because either they are free and difficult to use, or they are very cool and you can do everything with them, but they're really expensive. So we thought it would be a good idea to not charge any license fees. The next part was it should be open, right? Because open is the way forward. At least that was what we heard from everybody and what we thought was appropriate. So without it being open, you could not share anything, you could not collaborate, and you did not have a community with similar goals, right? And it was difficult to maintain. And then, of course, it should be pragmatic, because if you have a risk assessment tool, you actually want it to block you the least possible in your work. That's what you want. So time is also money, and that is why we should optimize, right? We should reduce the time needed to perform a risk assessment. Because a risk assessment needs to have a list of the assets. They have to cover all the risks, and we have to define the recommendations. And all of that needs to happen in a certain amount of time, because if we leave anything out, we have a big problem. And as much as we can reduce the time, we are in better shape, right? And another thing that many have forgotten somehow was the collaboration point, because collaboration reduces time as well. Why is reducing time so important? Well, if you have the global time, because we have to do it in iterations, so we have to repeatedly perform risk assessment, you have a certain amount of time allocated to the risk assessment itself, a certain amount of time dedicated to the implementation plan, and then, of course, a certain time dedicated to implement what has been discovered, right? So the further you can reduce the first two, the more time you have to implement what has been discovered. Right, so that is a good idea then to reduce the time. Then, talking about the optimizations, how can you actually go ahead and do the optimizations, because you don't want to leave anything out? Well, the first would be each asset has a certain amount of basic risks, right? So if we take, for example, a building, somehow, in a building we have theft, destructions, like that are related to lease privileges, either authorization that are flawed in physical boundaries, and so on and so forth. And you have also environmental problems, which we had in Luxembourg recently as well. But these are, for example, that could be like 4 risks which are attached to a building, right? These risks are the same for every company anywhere. They are higher or lower depending on where you are. I mean, flooding is not that important if you're like high up and there's no water around, so flooding is probably a very, very low probability, but still. And then when we have each asset where we could attach some basic risks, we need less time afterwards for modeling. Because when we model, right, I do our risk identification step, if you will. We have, for example, our printing service, which if we have a printing service, I'll just take it as an example. We have, for example, a building and a printer attached to our core business printing service, and each of these have their risks. So now what we only need to do is we would create our primary asset printing service, and then we could drag and drop, for example, a building and a printer. And because the building and the printer has already the basic risks attached, a lot of time is already removed because you don't need to think about all the risks that you need to attach. You need to add some risks maybe, right? But that also means that if the printer and the building have a certain amount of risk, that also means that your printing service, for example, would inherit those risks. Because if any of these risks if any of the scenario would take place, the printing service would either fail or be offline, right? So basically you could say the primary asset would inherit the risks, if you will. But not only that, since we are basing our formula on the standard impact, vulnerability, and threat, the impact is usually in context, or is always in context of the asset it's linked to, right? And because the risks are inherited to the printing service, in this case, it would also mean that the printing service would inherit the impactation down to your risks, to the individual risks. Well, you can still define them manually if you will, but that actually accelerates the time because it inherits, right? As I said, the side note is that our impact, well, besides the formula we use, our impact is the maximum between the confidentiality, integrity, and availability for the amount of impact. I will show that later on in a small demo how it works. And then there is the fact of sometimes a primary asset, for example, a printing service, and then there's a calligraphy service or whatever, they share the same building or the same office. Right? And instead of remodeling the same office twice with the same risks twice, we introduced the notion of global asset, which means you have one asset that you can put in many of the primary assets, if you will, and that is the same exact asset. So you only need to evaluate it once, right? And that is another speed up, if you will, because you don't have to re-evaluate everything. And then the next optimization is the report generation, right? Because if we have all the information in software, yes, we can export it in the CSV, and yes, we have a CSV export, but if you have to then manually copy-paste it into a report, that doesn't make sense either. So what we did was we implemented a sort of a direct report generation, which is based on customizable templates, and the export is currently in Word, so that you can actually, in your template, your personal template that you want, you can actually put the information that you desire for each of the phases, right? And then we also have an import, because if you have an export, somebody might perform a risk assessment, and it might be complete, but if you can't re-import it somewhere else, for example, if you want a risk model that you have created, you have a printing service that you have built up with all the risks attached, all the assets attached, and you want to share it with a colleague, maybe another company, or in another part of the company, you could actually export that risk model, and then you need to import it on the other side. So what you can is now import the whole risk assessment or parts of the risk assessment into your personal risk assessment, like we call it the risk model, which is a simple JSON file. It could be encrypted if you desire, because yeah, it could be encrypted, so you need a password. And then there will be a CSV import as well, soon. I say soonish, but it should be done pretty quickly. Then as the export the same, we have the risk models that we can export, JSON file, but they, as I said, they can be encrypted with and without the evaluation, so you can actually just export the risk model if you want to share it with the community, or you can export it with the values to regroup it in a bigger risk assessment or to show it to some regulator and so on. Right, and then of course CSV and the graphs in a dashboard can be exported as PNG, so you'll be fine. And everything needs to be open. That's like the sixth optimization that we made. Why is that an optimization? Well, first of all, if it's open source and somebody has a great feature they want implemented, well, you can just go ahead and do it. As it is on GitHub, completely open, you could do it. We chose Affero GPL v3 for all the code that we have. And for the models that we have created, the basic models that I will show you soon, we chosen to make it just public domain, right? So you can do whatever you want with them. So now I think me talking about every theory and so on is great, but we should look at some kind of demo if you want. So let's see. Good. Of course it does work great because it's a demo. It should always work. Hold on. There we go. Wow. What resolution is that screen if I... This one, okay. Perfect. Should be, is it readable? Readable, kind of. Let's put it, yeah, well. Let's see. Okay, so here, after I logged in, here's my risk assessments that I have performed, right? This one is complete one. I did all the work. You don't have to help this time. I did all the work, so this is a complete one. As you can see, this is basically the whole application as you see it here. So first of all, you notice that we have on the right side the typical menus. Let's put it in English, it's much more readable. Typical menus for user, settings, names. The error message you've seen is because I use a temporary user call with the domain at admin.test, and that's why there's an error, because it doesn't recognize it as a valid domain. But see, then below that, here in this one, you see a bar with numbers, and I said before we have 4 phases, right? Context establishment, risk identification or context modeling, then the evaluation, and then the last one is the monitoring, right? So we build it really like this. So you can click on each of these phases and you see, well, it's again in French, but I'm sorry. You see the different menus, the different phases with the different steps to do in each phase. And it is basically, the idea is basically very simple. It is, you can click on it, you have a certain thing to fill out. If you need help filling out, I mean, for the context establishment, everybody knows that there is a lot of talking involved, a lot of note-taking, and it is the most boring, but the most important step, because if you don't do it well, you have a lot of more work afterwards. But for that, we have provided some help that explain what should be asked in the discussion. So that is the idea to help there. The next thing we have is if you want to know if you have already done the phase, well, if you completed one of the phases, you just put a tick into the box and then you know you're done. Evaluation criteria can be customized as you wish. With the values. At this point you can't, because I already started the evaluation, and everybody knows that if you started the evaluation, readapting the evaluation criteria doesn't make sense, because it will kill the whole evaluation anyway, because it is no longer valid. And these are all the steps to be performed, one after another. It's kept very simple. Importing, exporting usually goes over a button like this. Here's your library that you have for available objects. And as I said before, all these objects here that we've created are public domain. So you can modify them, republish them the way you want. It is as simple as just dragging and dropping an element in here. For the printing service, like rotary press, we might want the backup. So basically, that's all you need to do. Each of these has attached risks to them, as I said before. Here, for example, for the backup, we have 2 common threats which are already evaluated. We put it in just now, and it is already evaluated. The reason for it is because it's a global object that I just inserted, and it is already evaluated someplace, so we don't have to reevaluate it. During the evaluation, the global objects, the global assets, as I said, are usually, let's say, yeah, the global objects are usually the highest one, the one with the highest impact, is the one that you evaluate. You can evaluate them individually, but for the quick one is the highest one that you evaluate. Great, and then this is then the risk assessment, and here on the right you have possibility for a dashboard, which shows you dashboard on different values, discrete bars, donut charts. Depends on what you require for your report that you want to present. There is different ones. We have a cartography that shows you how many of which are found. We have charts for vulnerability and so on and so forth. And then there is interview tables where you could add interviews, which is important as well, as we had found out. And of course, there is the statement of applicability, where you would have, in this case, the ISO 27000 something. I always mix them up. and where you have to argue why or why not you use it, and then of course the gap analysis on why you do not or how much you need to do to perform it. Last part is snapshots. You can do snapshots, so you can have a snapshot now, and then you can go on work. If you screw up, you can just reload the snapshot you find. The other thing you can do is view a snapshot before you restore it, so you can just see the snapshot and then say, okay, well, let's view it or let's not view it. Let's restore it or not restore it after you've seen that it is the right one. So these are basically very quick the functionality of this tool. So let's go back to very short, the last two slides. Good. So the last challenge we had was, well, the expert, right? So you have no internal experts, but the idea is to teach them very, very quickly. So first of all, for everybody that wants hands-on with this and see more in depth how the tool works and how it looks, we have a small workshop tomorrow morning. Please refer to the schedule because that's the most accurate, I was told. And then there is more in-depth trainings, which you can find on the MONARC.lu website /trainings. And then there is resource and documentation available for everybody to read and correct and everything. GitHub accounts, Twitter account, MONARC.lu web pages, and if you discover anything, because we're at a security conference here, if you discover anything that is threatening security of the tool, please contact us via the email address, because we want to do a silent fix before we publish what we have found, what has been found. You will definitely get contributions, of course. You will be mentioned that you have found it and we have solved it in conjunction with you to be able. But we want to do a silent fix just to be sure that nobody is having trouble afterwards, right? So that is everything that I wanted to say really quickly. If there are any questions, maybe?
Any questions in the room? Obviously, as Fabien said, if you want to get hands-on and down and dirty with it, you can go along tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning, yeah. I think it's 9:30-ish, but you have to see what it is actually at the end.
Okay, so yeah, if you check on the timetable, and you can go along to that. Okay.
For the workshop, just one thing: you need a laptop, right? So you need to bring your own computer. We will have the rest. We will have, but you need your own computer. Otherwise, it will be difficult to get a hands-on software. Just say.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Fabien.